Hi there, and welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's story begins inside the small church of St. Mary Mead, a place of peace, prayer, and secrets that sleep between the pages. During a routine cleaning, the vicar discovered something strange. A folded note hidden deep inside an old Bible. A note written in trembling handwriting, and stained with something that looked far too dark to be ink. It held just one sentence, a confession, or a warning. When Miss Marple hears of it, she recognizes the fear behind the words, and she knows immediately someone in the village has been carrying a burden far too heavy and far too dangerous. As she follows the trail of forgotten prayers and guilty hearts, Miss Marple uncovers a truth that was never meant to see the light, a truth that hid itself in the holiest place of all. Stay with us till the end. And if you love mysteries where even faith holds secrets, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Haunting Vales. Chapter 1. The Quiet Discovery. The bells of St. Mary Mead rang out on a mild Sunday morning, their echo drifting across the cottages, hedges, and narrow lanes of the village. It was a peaceful sound, familiar, reassuring, the kind of sound that made one believe nothing truly dreadful could happen in such a place. Inside the little church, sunlight fell through the stained glass, casting patches of soft color over the polished pews. The congregation stood together in polite rows, voices lifting in the final verse of the hymn. Reverend Clement's calm tones guided them, steady and kind, as they reached the closing prayer. Miss Jane Marple sat near the aisle, her delicate hands folded neatly on her lap. A small Bible rested before her, worn from years of gentle use. Her blue eyes, sharp despite her age, wandered from the pulpit to the faces around her. Mrs. Price Ridley whispering behind her hymn book, young Timothy Archer yawning into his sleeve, and poor Miss Hartnell staring off into the rafters. That it was all so ordinary. And yet, Miss Marple had learned long ago that even in ordinary places, small things could hold large secrets. When the final Amen was spoken, she waited for the others to leave. She liked the silence that followed the service, that brief hush when the echo of prayer still lingered in the air. She gathered her gloves and reached for her Bible. But as she closed it, something thin slipped free and fluttered softly to the floor, a folded piece of paper. Miss Marple frowned slightly, bending to retrieve it. She was a tidy woman, and she could not recall ever leaving anything inside her Bible but a bookmark. The paper was yellowed and brittle at the edges, as if it had been tucked away for many years. Her name was not written on it. She unfolded it with care. The handwriting was neat, a woman's hand, small and elegant, but trembling slightly. "Forgive me, Father, for I have done what cannot be undone. The truth lies beneath the oak." Miss Marple stared at the words for several seconds, her brows drawn together. "Beneath the oak," she whispered, her eyes lifted toward the tall window. Through the colored glass, she could just make out the churchyard beyond, rows of quiet gravestones, and in their midst, a great oak tree older than anyone in the village. Reverend Clement approached from behind, smiling as he wiped his spectacles. "Still here, Miss Marple? Planning to solve the mysteries of the Psalms today?" he said kindly. She looked up and smiled. "Not mysteries of Scripture, Reverend. Perhaps mysteries of a more earthly sort." He chuckled politely. "Ah, your detective mind never rests." "Evil doesn't rest either," she replied, almost absently. "It hides quite comfortably, even among hymns and holy verses." He laughed again, though less certain this time, and excused himself to greet parishioners at the door. Miss Marple folded the note and slipped it into her glove. The words replayed quietly in her mind. "Forgive me, Father. The truth lies beneath the oak." The tone was unmistakable. A confession, desperate, sorrowful, and secret. That afternoon, Miss Marple sat in her garden, trimming dead blooms from her rose bushes. The sun was warm, and a faint breeze stirred the petals that had fallen to the path. Yet her mind was far from gardening. The note troubled her. It was not the words alone, but the sense of pain behind them, the voice of someone seeking peace too late. After tea, she fetched her magnifying glass and examined the paper by lamplight. The ink had browned with age, the edges slightly brittle. Whoever wrote it had done so many years ago. Still, she wondered, why her Bible? It was always kept on her bedside table. But then she remembered, 2 weeks ago, during a heavy rain, she had forgotten it in her pew. The verger had returned it to her the following Sunday, which meant the note could have been there for days or decades, unnoticed until now. Miss Marple set the note down, folded her hands, and thought. If the truth lay beneath the oak, then the oak would need a closer look. The next morning, St. Mary Mead was alive with its usual rhythm. Milk delivered, curtains shaken out, gossip exchanged at the post office. Miss Marple walked to the church, under the pretense of admiring the spring flowers, her shawl wrapped neatly around her shoulders. The churchyard was empty, save for old Mr. Archer, the gardener, pruning hedges along the wall. Miss Marple's eyes moved to the oak. It stood proud and ancient, its roots pushing through the soil like the hands of time itself. Beneath its wide branches, the grass grew uneven. She stepped closer. The ground there seemed disturbed. A faint rise and fall where the earth had once been dug and settled again. She pressed her cane gently into the spot. The soil sank slightly, softer than it should have been. Miss Marple straightened, her lips a thin line. She murmured softly. So it was not just poetry after all. She turned to Mr. Archer, who was wiping his brow nearby. Such fine work, Mr. Archer. You must know every inch of this yard. He smiled. I, Miss Marple. Been tending it near 15 years. Tell me, she said casually, have you ever had trouble with foxes? Or moles? Near that oak, perhaps. He scratched his head. Now you mention it. Miss, the ground there's always a bit soft. Never knew why. Thought to dig it up one of these days. Miss Marple's eyes glimmered. If you should, Mr. Archer, do be so kind as to let me know what you find. He promised he would be why evening. He was at her cottage door, pale, nervous, hat in hand. Miss Marple, he said, his voice uneasy. I dug where the ground was soft, just a little, and, well, I found this. He held out a small wooden box, damp and covered in soil. Miss Marple rose slowly. A box? Yes, ma'am. Buried deep enough to keep dry, but the wood's near rotten. I didn't open it. I thought, best let you see first. She placed it on her table, fetched a small letter opener, and lifted the lid carefully. Inside, wrapped in a strip of faded cloth, lay a small child's rattle, tarnished with age. Beside it, a silver brooch shaped like a dove. Miss Marple stared at the items in silence. A child's toy, she said softly, and a woman's brooch. The gardener shifted uneasily. There's no name or anything, miss. Do you reckon it's something bad? She looked up, her expression unreadable. Bad? Yes, but not in the way you think. Thank you, Mr. Archer. Please, say nothing to anyone for now. He nodded quickly and left, clearly relieved. When he was gone, Miss Marple sat very still. Her hands rested lightly on the box. There was sorrow here, deep sorrow, the kind that lingers long after tears have dried. She thought of the note. Forgive me, Father, a confession, a secret buried with trembling hands. Perhaps not murder, but something close enough to cast a long shadow. That night, she sat by the fire, the box before her. Outside, the rain had returned, tapping gently against the window. She turned the brooch over in her hand. The back was engraved faintly with initials, L.H. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Lydia Hale, she remembered the name. A quiet woman who had lived on Willow Lane before the war. Kind, soft-spoken, and forever in mourning. She had lost a child, so the story went. A tragedy never discussed. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, thinking. The dates matched. The initials matched. And the note, it was written in a woman's hand. Trembling with guilt, she whispered, softly, "Oh, Lydia, what have you done?" Her eyes fell again to the line. The truth lies beneath the oak. And so it had. The following day, Miss Marple paid a polite visit to Mrs. Price Ridley, who was delighted to share tea and gossip. "Oh, yes, Miss Marple," she said eagerly. "Poor Lydia Hale. Tragic creature. Lost her little one before the war. They said it was illness, but there were whispers. You know how people talk. She never quite recovered." "Indeed," Miss Marple said gently. "And her husband? Died a few years later. A drinker, I think. Terrible business altogether." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "And her family?" "Only her niece, Clara. Lives in the next parish. Visits the grave often." "The grave," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Is it near the oak?" Mrs. Price Ridley blinked. "Why, yes, quite near, now that you mention it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "How curious." That evening, Miss Marple placed the box back on her table. The light from the lamp glowed softly over the worn wood. She knew what she had uncovered was not the end of the story. It was merely the beginning, a whisper from the past, reaching up through the earth. Someone had buried their sin long ago beneath that oak. And now, after all these years, it had found its way back to the surface. Miss Marple folded the note once more and slipped it between the pages of her Bible. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were grave. "In St. Mary Mead," she murmured, "truth never stays buried for long." The clock struck 9. Outside, the rain fell steadily, washing the quiet village clean, but not clean enough to erase what had just been unearthed. And in the stillness of her cottage, Miss Marple began to form the first quiet threads of a mystery that would soon reach far deeper than any of them imagined. Chapter 2. The Shadow Beneath the Oak. Morning in St. Mary Mead dawned pale and cool, with a thin layer of mist crawling over the lawns and hedges. It softened the world, blurring edges, muting colors, and turning the familiar village lanes into quiet paths of silver haze. Miss Marple stood by her window, hands lightly resting against the sill. She had hardly slept. The note, the rattle, the brooch, they weighed heavily on her mind. Secrets never stayed buried in this village, especially when they tugged so insistently at the corners of the past. She watched as the mist drifted across the churchyard in the distance, lingering around the ancient oak like a ghost reluctant to leave. Something dark lay beneath that soil, not dark in the sense of violence, but dark in the sense of sorrow. A sorrow that had been hidden, perhaps forgotten by most, but not forgiven. After a simple breakfast, she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped out into the morning air. The lane was quiet, save for the distant sound of a milk cart and the cheerful chatter of birds. But Miss Marple heard none of it. Her thoughts were on Lydia Hale, the woman behind the engraved initials, behind the brooch, behind the trembling handwriting in the note hidden in her Bible. She had known Lydia, though not well. Lydia had been a gentle soul, pale, soft-spoken, often seen walking alone with a distant look in her eyes. There had been something fragile about her, something stretched thin by grief. Lydia had died years ago, leaving behind little more than whispers. Miss Marple walked to the churchyard with careful steps, her cane tapping softly on the path. As she approached the oak, she saw someone standing beneath it, a young woman in a navy coat. Her hands clasped tightly in front of her, Clara Hale. Lydia's niece, Clara visited her aunt's grave often, but today she stood in an unusual spot, not by the gravestone, but directly beside the oak tree. Her gaze was fixed on the earth, as if she sensed something had changed. Miss Marple paused, her expression gentle. "Good morning, my dear." Clara looked up with a start. She was a striking young woman in her late 20s, with dark hair pinned neatly beneath a hat and eyes that carried the same haunting sadness Lydia had once carried. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said softly. "You surprised me." "I apologize," Miss Marple said kindly. The morning is so very still. I suppose one can appear rather suddenly. Clara's eyes drifted back to the oak. Something feels strange today. Miss Marple stepped closer. The soil, now disturbed by Mr. Archer's digging, had settled unevenly. Clara's gaze lingered on the spot. Is something the matter? Miss Marple asked gently. Clara hesitated. My aunt used to sit beneath this tree. Long before she passed. She always said it was a comforting place. I suppose I feel drawn to it, too, though I've never quite understood why. Miss Marple watched her closely. There was something in Clara's voice, a tremor, a worry held close. Your aunt was a thoughtful woman, Miss Marple said quietly. And a private one. Clara sighed. Yes, too private, perhaps. She kept much to herself. Even in her final days, she refused to speak of certain things. Miss Marple's eyes lowered to the disturbed patch of ground. Secrets can be a heavy burden. Clara nodded, staring at the soil as if it held an answer she feared to uncover. Do you think, she said slowly, that a person's sorrow can remain in a place, even after they've gone? Miss Marple touched her hand lightly. Yes, sometimes it lingers, waiting to be understood. Clara swallowed hard and gently stepped away from the tree. I should go, she murmured. Thank you for speaking with me. She turned and walked down the path. Her steps hurried, almost anxious. Miss Marple watched her go with thoughtful eyes. If Clara knew something, even unconsciously, it would need to be coaxed out with care. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage. Reverend Clement greeted her warmly, though he appeared tired, his spectacles slightly smudged. Miss Marple, please, come in, he said with a smile. Is this about the collection boxes again? I promise the new labels will be ready by Sunday. Not at all, Reverend, she said as she stepped inside. I wanted to speak with you about Lydia Hale. Reverend Clement's smile faded. Ah, poor Lydia. A sad case. Very sad, Miss Marple agreed gently. But I wondered, do you recall her last days? He led her to the sitting room and motioned for her to sit. I remember she asked for prayer often. She seemed troubled in her spirit, though she would not say why. I assumed it was grief. Losing a child is a burden beyond words. Miss Marple nodded. And the child, the illness, as people said? Reverend Clement sighed. Yes, that was the story. The boy died in his sleep. A quiet passing. Miss Marple's voice remained soft. But you do not believe that was the full truth. The Reverend hesitated. His eyes moved to the window. I always sensed there was more. Lydia was a devoted mother. Yet she lived in constant fear after the child died. Fear of judgment. Fear of what people might think. Fear that she had not been forgiven. Miss Marple folded her hands. Fear born from guilt, perhaps. Perhaps, he said quietly. But guilt for what, I never knew. She carried it to her grave. Outside, a crow called once, breaking the silence. Miss Marple stood. Thank you, Reverend. You have been most helpful. As she left the vicarage, she felt the threads of the mystery tightening. Lydia's sorrow was not just grief, it was guilt. And guilt left clues. The next person who needed visiting was Mrs. Hartnell, sharp-tongued, sharp-eyed, and entirely incapable of keeping a secret to herself. She lived in a small cottage overflowing with plants, knitting needles, and half-finished sewing. Projects. Mrs. Hartnell welcomed Miss Marple with tea poured far too quickly and biscuits served on a plate already, dusted with crumbs. I hear you've been asking. About Lydia Hale, she said, wasting no time. A tragic woman. Poor thing was never right after she lost the boy. Miss Marple stirred her tea calmly. Yes, I heard the death was peaceful. Mrs. Hartnell snorted. That's what was said. But I remember that night. There was nothing peaceful about Lydia's screams. Miss Marple looked up sharply. Screams. Oh yes. Carried down the lane like wildfire. Woke half the village. She came running for help, crying that her son wouldn't wake up. And the cause of death? Mrs. Hartnell shrugged. Dr. Hayward said it was an illness. A sudden one. But he looked uneasy. Sweaty brow, trembling hands. I always thought something was off. Miss Marple's voice lowered. Did you ever see the child? Once, Mrs. Hartnell said softly. A quiet little boy, pale, always clinging to his mother's hand. Never saw him play. Never heard him laugh. Miss Marple paused. Do you remember his name? Mrs. Hartnell frowned. Now that you ask. No. Isn't that odd? Everyone knew Lydia's name. Everyone knew her husband's name. But the child's? I don't recall anyone saying it. A coldness settled in Miss Marple's chest that a child with no name remembered. A sudden death that raised quiet suspicion. A mother broken by guilt. A grave near the oak. A buried box containing a toy and a brooch. The picture was forming, and it was darker than she had imagined. That evening, the rain returned with a steady rhythm. Miss Marple sat by the fire once more, the heat casting soft shadows across her sitting room. The wooden box lay on the table. She had placed the rattle beside it, its once bright metal now dull with age. She picked it up, shaking it gently. A faint, hollow sound came from inside, a sound that did not match the simple toy it appeared to be. Miss Marple froze. The tears of metal did not rattle naturally. There was something inside the toy, something additional, something hidden. Her hands steady. She reached for a small screwdriver from her sewing drawer and gently pried the rattle open. Inside, wrapped tightly in a scrap of cloth, was a tiny locket, ornate, silver, engraved with the letter L. Miss Marple opened it. Inside was a photograph of a woman, Lydia, and beside her, not a child, but a baby who looked nothing like the man Lydia had married. Miss Marple drew a sharp breath. Oh dear, she whispered. Oh, Lydia, this is what you were hiding. This was not sorrow alone. This was scandal. A child born of another man. A secret that, in those days, could destroy a woman's life. Miss Marple closed her eyes. Lydia had not feared judgment from God alone. She had feared judgment from her husband. Had he known? Had he found out? Had there been a struggle? Had something terrible happened on the night the child died? And then, another thought struck her, cold and clear. If Lydia's husband had discovered the truth, would Lydia have buried this box beneath the oak to protect her child's identity? To protect the real father? Or had someone else buried it? To hide what they had done? Miss Marple's breath eased out slowly. She could feel the truth now, hiding just beyond reach. She needed one more thread, one that Clara might hold. The next morning, Miss Marple visited Clara at her small cottage. Clara looked anxious when she opened the door, but she stepped aside to let Miss Marple in. Clara, my dear, Miss Marple said in her soft, warm voice. I have a difficult question, one I ask with great respect. Clara nodded slowly, bracing herself. You may ask. Your Aunt Lydia, Miss Marple began, was she ever unhappy in her marriage? A flicker of emotion flashed across Clara's face, too fast to hide. Yes, she whispered. Terribly. Did her husband treat her unkindly? Clara hesitated, then gave the faintest nod. He drank. He had a temper. She feared him more than she ever admitted. Miss Marple's heart tightened. Did she ever speak of her child? Not the illness, but anything else. Clara turned away, gripping the back of a chair. She once told me. She once said the child was her greatest joy and her greatest punishment. I never understood what she meant. Miss Marple approached her gently. Clara, did she ever tell you the child's name? Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. No, and I always found that strange. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment. Yes, it all fit. All of it. She opened her eyes again. Clara, I need you to be very brave. We may uncover something that has been hidden for many years, something that might bring your aunt the peace she never found. Clara turned toward her, eyes glistening. You think something terrible happened, don't you? Miss Marple took her hand. I think a truth was buried that should not have been, and now it is asking to be found. Clara swallowed hard. Then, tell me what to do. Miss Marple reached into her bag and removed the brooch. Clara gasped softly. This was my aunt's, she whispered. She wore it every day. Miss Marple nodded. It was found beneath the oak. Clara covered her mouth with her hand as tears filled her eyes. Why would it be there? Why would she bury it? She was hiding something, Miss Marple said gently. Something precious. And something painful. Clara trembled. What do we do now? Miss Marple's voice was calm but firm. We go to Dr. Hayward. Dr. Hayward lived in a stone house on the edge of the village. He was older now, his hair silver, his steps slower. But his eyes, those sharp, observant eyes, had not dulled that he looked surprised when Miss Marple and Clara arrived together. Miss Marple. Miss Hale. What brings you both here? Miss Marple stepped forward. Doctor, it concerns Lydia Hale. He stiffened slightly. Lydia? That was a long time ago. Yes, Miss Marple said gently. But some truths do not fade with time. Dr. Hayward motioned them inside, his jaw tightening. Miss Marple placed the child's rattle on the table. The doctor stared at it, and in that moment, in that single, flickering moment, Miss Marple saw it, recognition. Fear. Guilt. She spoke softly. Doctor, Lydia did not lose her child to illness, did she? Clara gasped. Miss Marple. Dr. Hayward sank into a chair, his shoulders slumping as if decades of weight had suddenly returned. His voice broke when he finally spoke. No, he whispered. No, she didn't. Clara covered her mouth as tears slid down her cheeks. Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on Clara's shoulder and turned gently back to the doctor. Tell us what happened. Dr. Hayward stared at the rattle, at the locket, at the past he had tried so hard to bury, and then he began to speak. Chapter 3. The Truth Revealed. Dr. Hayward sat motionless for several seconds, his fingers resting against the edge of the table as though he needed something steady to hold on to. The room felt very quiet, too quiet, except for the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. Clara stood beside Miss Marple, pale and tense, her eyes fixed on the doctor with a mixture of fear and desperate curiosity. At last, he drew a long breath. It was many years ago, he began quietly, but I remember it as if it were yesterday. I was a young doctor then. Too young, far too eager to trust the explanations people gave me, even when my instincts said otherwise. His gaze moved to the rattle lying on the table. Lydia called me to the house late one night, he continued. She was holding the child in her arms, crying, shaking. She kept saying the boy wouldn't wake. I examined him, and yes, it was clear he had passed. But the cause, his voice dropped, was not illness. It was neglect. Clara gasped. Neglect? My aunt would never. She loved that child. I know she did. Dr. Hayward said quickly, sorrow in his voice. But love is complicated. Fear can twist it. She had been hiding something from her husband, something that consumed her. Miss Marple nodded slowly. The child's father. Dr. Hayward met her eyes, pain flickering across his face. Yes, Lydia confided in me months before the child's death. Her husband had suspicions. He had a temper, as you know. She lived in constant fear that he would discover the truth. She barely slept. She barely ate. She was exhausted, frightened, and desperate. Clara brought a trembling hand to her mouth. Dr. Hayward continued. On the night the child died, Lydia had put him to bed earlier than usual. She meant only to rest for a moment, but she fell into a heavy sleep. She didn't hear him cough. She didn't hear him struggle to breathe. By the time she woke and ran to him, it was too late. He closed his eyes. When she realized what had happened, she broke. She kept repeating, he wasn't meant to suffer. I only wanted to protect him. She begged me not to say the truth. She begged me. Clara's voice came out small and broken. So you told everyone it was illness? Yes, Dr. Hayward whispered. I believed I was protecting her. Perhaps I was protecting myself as well. She was already so fragile, and if her husband learned the truth, I feared even greater harm. Miss Marple absorbed this quietly. The truth was heavy, but it was not malicious. It was human, deeply, painfully human. And the box? She asked gently. The rattle, the brooch, the locket? Dr. Hayward swallowed. After the burial, Lydia came to me with those items. She said she couldn't keep them near her. They made her heart ache. But she also said she couldn't destroy them. His voice tightened. She asked me to bury them somewhere safe, somewhere peaceful. I chose the oak tree. Miss Marple's eyes softened. The confession in the Bible had not been to hide a crime. It had been a plea for forgiveness from a mother who felt she had failed her child. Did her husband ever know? Miss Marple asked quietly. Dr. Hayward shook his head. No. Lydia died, still carrying her guilt. Her husband never spoke of the child again after the burial. He drank more. He grew distant. And then eventually, he died himself. Clara pressed her hands to her eyes, tears falling freely. All these years, she whispered. All these years I thought my aunt kept secrets because she didn't trust me, but it was because she wanted to protect everyone else. Miss Marple touched her shoulder gently. Yes, my dear. Some secrets are born from love, even when they look like sorrow. Clara sank into a chair, her breath shaky but steadying. She wasn't a bad mother, she whispered. She made a mistake. A terrible mistake. But she loved him. Very much, Miss Marple said. Enough to bury her pain, rather than let it harm anyone else. For a long while, the three of them sat quietly. Outside, the afternoon sun crept slowly across the sky, its light softening into gold. At last, Dr. Hayward spoke again, his voice hoarse. What will you do with the box? Miss Marple looked at Clara. That decision, she said gently, belongs to her. Clara rose slowly. She approached the rattle, the brooch, the locket. Her aunt's hidden legacy. With care, she placed the items back into the wooden box and closed the lid. I want to return it to the oak, she said softly. Not to hide it, but so it can rest. Properly. With the truth known. Miss Marple nodded with approval. A wise choice. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage. The fire crackled warmly, and the familiar scent of lavender drifted from the pot on the stove. She sat by the window, her Bible resting near her hand. The note was still tucked inside, its edges worn. She opened it once more. Forgive me, Father, for I have done what cannot be undone. The truth lies beneath the oak. Miss Marple read it slowly, then folded it with care. It was not a confession of wrongdoing. It was the cry of a mother living in fear. A mother who loved too fiercely and carried her sorrow alone. Miss Marple placed the note back inside her Bible and closed it gently. St. Mary Mead was quiet again, but the quiet felt different now. Lighter, as though something long shadowed had finally stepped into the light. The oak tree, she knew, would stand watch over its secret. But now, it was a secret no longer rooted in pain, but in understanding. Miss Marple turned down the lamp, letting the soft warmth of the fire illuminate the room. Outside, the night deepened, calm and steady. In the stillness, she whispered quietly, "No secret stays buried forever." If you enjoyed this mystery and want more stories just like it, with all the twists, shadows, and quiet truths of Miss Marple's world, make sure you watch the next mystery on my channel. There's always another secret waiting to be uncovered.